Tracy, coming to you live from New Hampshire Writers Project headquarters. And I am here tonight with Ian M. Rogers. How are you, Ian?
Very good, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us all the way from Japan. What time
Yes,
is it
yes.
over there?
It is 7 a.m. on Wednesday, actually. So 13
Okay,
hours
so
time
it's
difference at this part of
all
the
right.
year.
So it's
So
not like 3 a.m., some weird odd time.
no, 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 no,
No.
no, no, no. Nothing,
Good.
nothing
Okay.
like
Well, I
that. This
do
was good
appreciate
encouragement to get up early, actually, which is always
it.
good. But,
Well, good, good. I'm glad.
mm,
Well, I'm really glad that you could join us because I know you've got an exciting workshop that you are offering at the 603 Writers Conference, which is coming up quick on June 14th. And we were just talking behind the scenes. This is your first time presenting.
mm,
So I'm very excited for people to get to know a little bit more about you and
mm,
the presentation that you're going to be offering.
mm.
So if you're all set, you want to jump into it?
Of course, yeah, yeah. So again,
Awesome.
this is really exciting.
Okay, cool. So, if people are not aware, you wear many hats. You're a writer, you're an editor, you're a teacher.
Mm,
So, I'm curious, how do these roles influence the way you approach storytelling, especially in long
mm.
form work like novels and memoirs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's interesting to me that you kind of separate those roles in that way, the writer, editor, teacher, because for me they really do feel like very natural extensions of one another. Learning to become a better writer for me helped me with develop better editing skills with looking at other people's work, and then editing other people's work has helped influence my own work. And then the teaching to me is sort of a natural extension of that. Working with books, literature, writing, even things like grammar and sentence structure myself has helped me in turn teach it to others, and then vice versa. A lot of people say that the best teachers, the teaching helps them develop their own work better. So for me, it all fits together pretty holistically.
That's amazing. Well, and if people
Mm,
don't know you, obviously we said you were an author. They might not be familiar
mm,
with your first book, which was the MFA Thesis Novel.
mm.
And I found it particularly interesting that it was a satirical take on academia. So I'm curious, what lessons did that project teach you about structure and narrative cohesion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So from the beginning, I wanted to write a story that was, a little bit non-standard or off the mark or took innovative risks in that kind of way. A lot of my favorite fiction, is the fiction that does do things that are different. The Nabokovs, the Joseph Hellers, the modernist fiction, the Faulkners and things like that. But I wanted to write something that took those kinds of risks, but was also palatable to the modern audience, that kind of way. So one thing that fit together really well was in MFA Thesis Novel, there's the main story with Flip, who's the main character. He's trying to become a writer. He's in academia. And sort of interspaced between these chapters of the kind of real world narrative are the books that he and the other characters are writing, essentially. And a lot of these books are not very good or absurd, or they're, presented in kind of an absurd way, fit in. One of them is, told through handwriting, actually scrawled on the page that I had written. There's different fonts and setup. The published book has a title page and things like that. And I wanted a book that, looked more interesting if somebody picked it up at a bookstore and flipped through and they'd see the handwritten part or the different fonts and they'd wonder, what is that? And then for the people who are reading the book, something to kind of break up the narrative in that way.
It's interesting. It seems like an interesting genre to tackle. And I noticed as I was
Mm,
reviewing your website as well, you've got a lot of humor throughout your website. It's really
mm,
interesting to go through the different pages and learn more about you
mm.
from that perspective. So I'm assuming that obviously I haven't read your book, that humorous side of
Mm.
you transitions into your writing as well.
It is. I think in my regular non-writing life, I'm a funny person. I love jokes and silliness and adding levity to different kinds of situations. And for me, a lot of my growth as a writer, and learning to write, naturally, the writing that made sense to me was sort of using that humor or learning to, integrate my own humorous perspective of seeing the world onto the page in ways that people would find fun and interesting. It would help them see the world in a different way. A lot of my favorite satirical writers were able to do that, particularly Joseph Heller. Where he uses humor to sort of point out the absurdity of things in life or work, or the army in his case with Catch 22, things that maybe don't make sense. And so humor can be a powerful lens for showing us those things about the world.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And we're talking about that. You are currently in Japan now, and I assume, are you there
Mm.
teaching? right?
No. I'm visiting my partner who lives here.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I didn't mean to get
No, no, no,
personal
no,
with
no,
you.
no. Yeah. It's a no. I usually spend a few weeks a year here abroad. So, and it's
Well,
nice to be back. And
I find it fascinating that you taught English there. That must have been an amazing experience.
it was very, very nice. So I taught here for 5 years, 5.5 years. I taught elementary school. I taught at a private school for adults, and I taught university for a little while. And it was a great experience. It taught me a lot about just a different culture, but also when you teach English, like English as a second language, it forces you to learn about English in a more in-depth way than most native speakers usually look at it. It teaches you all sorts of things about grammar, but also sort of how our language is structured. Japanese is very attuned to different levels of politeness. And so when Japanese learn English, they're often very interested in, how can I say this in a more polite way or a more casual way? So as a teacher, hearing those kinds of questions, it would force me to think about my own language in that way. And in a sense, have a better control over the type of language that you're using, which was tremendously, tremendously helpful for me.
That's an interesting perspective. Huh. I never thought
Mhm.
of it that way. Huh.
Mhm.
Well, oh, did you have a follow-up thought?
Oh no, I was just going to say, and then as well, just living in another country, studying a different language, studying Japanese, forced me to learn more about English as well. Japanese grammar is structured very differently than
Hmm.
English grammar. So in English we would say I ate the sandwich. In Japanese they would say I the sandwich ate. So they would put the verb at the end of the sentence, and sandwich, which is the object, would be in the middle. So forcing your brain to sort of readjust to this different way of setting up a sentence, it forces you to think about English in terms of subjects, objects, and verbs in that kind of way. And so, once you start seeing English that way, and actually thinking about the language as sort of building blocks and components, that can actually help with writing as well, try setting up clearer sentences, making sure your sentences have all those components and so on. So again, I talked about the different things I do being very symbiotic, fitting together in that way. I think learning another language is just another component of that.
Yeah, it seems like it would give you more of an appreciation of the English language too. The more languages, yeah, you study.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. I always think of Nabokov as a good example. He spoke three languages fluently, Russian, English, and French. And because of his, command of those different languages, not only was he able to work aspects of, French and, or excuse me, French and Russian into his novels, but looking at English as a second language speaker, it allowed him to see sort of the different ebbs and flows, the different way words could be put together. Lolita has, sort of the very high old European English combined with this, 1950s pop culture English of like movie magazines and hot fudge sundaes in it, so kind of combining those things in an interesting way. I think he did that in ways that only a second language speaker can.
Interesting. Well, I'm curious about the workshop that you're going to be offering at the
Mhm.
603 Writers Conference called Seeing the Big Picture,
Mhm.
Structuring Novels and Memoirs. Can you tell us a little bit about what this workshop is about and how participants will benefit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this idea of sort of looking at the bigger picture of a story or looking at the structure of a story was something that really did manifest itself out of my editing work with clients. I had a lot of clients who were, maybe very good at writing, sentences and paragraphs and structuring scenes, but maybe when it came to putting those scenes together for a novel with a beginning and a middle and an end, they were struggling in various ways, a weaker beginning or maybe a sagging middle or maybe an ending where things didn't come together maybe, and then there would be disconnections between the beginning and the end. And as a result of kind of working through these issues with clients, it made me realize, wait a minute, one, this is something that a lot of writers, particularly emerging writers, are having trouble with, and maybe doesn't get taught in a short story class because there's not enough time. But then two is something that again just isn't presented. So again, I was really looking to fill a need in that way and talk about this sort of beginning, middle, end structure, and then how writers can use it in their own work as well.
Hmm. Well, and also you mentioned that you're going to touch on concepts like Aristotle's three-act structure and
Yes,
Chekhov's gun. These are things I've never heard about, so I'm
yes,
curious.
yes, yes, yes.
How do these play into your
No, that's a
workshop?
really That's a really good question. So I guarantee you have heard of them and seen them on the page millions of times, but you
Okay.
didn't know that they were called Aristotle's three-act structure and Chekhov's gun in that
Okay.
kind of way. So Aristotle's three-act structure is just sort of a classical representation of how Western stories are set up in this kind of way. So anytime, any Netflix show, 99% of books, TV, different kinds of oral tradition storytelling, it's the idea that there's a beginning where things get set up, a middle where things get developed and fleshed out further, and then they hasten towards a climax at the end. And we're so used to seeing this and reading it in different kinds of stories that we've really internalized it in this kind of way. So one thing that was helpful for me as a writer, learning about this, in college especially, was to actually, take this theoretical concept that, again, we've internalized so much, and, talk about it more directly, present it more directly, so people can say like, oh, wow, that makes sense, and then things can click a little bit. You mentioned Chekhov's gun as well. That's very powerful. The idea that, a writer should set something up in a story to build towards a payoff or a climax later is something that can really create strong connections in a story, something that then maybe doesn't get talked about very often. And two, once writers start seeing and thinking about their stories in this way, I found that it's very, very easy to implement, especially if you have a rough draft and maybe, you have a climax that maybe isn't, built up to as naturally as it maybe could. Going in and putting in that earlier setup earlier in the story to kind of build up to what you wanted to say can be really, really powerful.
Oh, interesting. Well, let's say I am a potential participant in your class and
Mm,
I've got a messy draft. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed about it.
mm.
What can you say to make me kind of get out of my comfort zone and be interested in taking your class?
So first, can I just say you are not alone? There's a lot of writers with messy drafts in there, nothing to be ashamed of. Again, it can feel very overwhelming because, you spent months, if not years, working on this manuscript. It can be really, really hard to sit down and look at it objectively and think about what needs to be done or how to get it to, a publishable type of quality. I'm hoping that by looking at these bigger picture issues, the structure, the Chekhov's gun, the setups, the payoffs that we've been talking about, it can help writers maybe, step back and look more critically at their draft and say, okay, how can I maybe identify these elements in my own work and make sure they're highlighted, and maybe some of the things that aren't working or aren't necessary, maybe those can be cut out in that kind of way. And that's just a way of learning about the editing process, which again, I think a lot of workshops, classes, certainly high school and college don't spend enough time talking about that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you validating the fact that there are several writers, authors in the same boat, and you shouldn't feel uncomfortable coming to your workshop or any of the other workshops that we're offering because there's going to be many other people in the same place. And one of the, I've interviewed many of the workshop presenters for the 603 coming
Mm,
up. And one of the things that I love is everybody is clear on the fact that there's so many opportunities to network with your peers and learn from your peers. So whether
mm,
you're starting at the very beginning or maybe haven't written any word at
mm.
all, or you're someone who's relatively experienced, there's still so much for you to learn
Yeah.
just in
Yeah.
this format.
Yes, I think that the best conferences, the best workshops, the best writing, activities of any kind, they really will appeal to sort of multiple levels. Levels sound so elementary, but writers who are at different stages of their careers. So the idea that the same workshop could be beneficial to somebody who's just starting out, and could also be beneficial for somebody who's, at a more advanced stage, but is maybe looking to level up their game in some way. And that's something that I always strive for in my work, to really appeal to that broader swath, instead of, keeping things too basic, or, keeping things too, highfalutin or advanced, so that people get lost in that way. That's a really good point that you just made.
Well, and before I let you go, Ian, and I
Of course, of
really
course.
appreciated your time today. This has been a fascinating
Mm,
conversation. I'm just curious, what would you say to someone who's thinking about going to the
mm.
603, is concerned about the investment? What would you say potentially to get them over that hump?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I've been a New Hampshire resident for a very long time. I lived in the state, on and off for many, many years. And one thing that I found was that the New Hampshire Writers Project was really the best group of its kind in New Hampshire. And there's a lot of good resources there for authors who are at different stages of their careers. I've been to the 603 conference twice, once way back in 2013, and then once 2 years ago after I came back to the state. both times were really good for reading, meeting people, networking, but also, meeting different kinds of writers, seeing different kinds of writers and projects, and really getting stimulated in that way, and then sort of leveling up my writing game as well. So, if you're free that day, if you have the time, if you're serious about developing your writing, and even just want to meet some people and see what's out there, I think it's definitely worth checking out in that way.
Well, and it's really nice to see you come full circle as well. First being an attendee and
Mhm.
now teaching one of the workshops. So we appreciate your support and your
Of
continued
course, of course.
support. And thank you for being here with me tonight, all the way
Mhm.
from Japan. That is amazing. Very excited about your workshop. Thank you
Mhm.
to those of you who gave us a watch tonight.
Mhm.
And if you're watching on the replay and have any questions, just go ahead and tag us. If you have questions for Ian as well, we can get those answers for you. So again, tickets are currently on sale for the 603 Writers Conference happening at Southern New Hampshire University. And that is on June 14th, as it is an all-day conference with Tess Gerritsen as our keynote. We'd love to see you there. So thanks again, Ian, and everyone have a great night. Hopefully we'll see you at the conference.
Nice. Thanks much, Tracy. It was excellent talking with you.
Same. Thank you.